Hello and welcome everyone to Cyber Risk Management for Law Firms, what you need to know. I'm very excited to be speaking with a lovely lady called Simone Herbert-Lowe, who by all means is an expert in this space, and she's director at Law and Cyber. Before we get started with the conversation, just a little thing to note, which I think is important. So the conversation is very much intended for general information purposes and does not constitute legal, business, IT, or other professional advice. I think you can tell that Simone is an ex-lawyer. She's kindly asked me to include that, but I think very important when we talk about a space that is constantly changing. For those of you who are new, here's just a very brief introduction on Intel and what it stands for. So Practice Evolve launched the Intel series earlier in the year, very much with the intent of trying to equip Australian law firms and legal professionals with innovative strategies for a more sustainable growth in a field and an industry that we know is constantly and rapidly evolving. And the way that we aim to do that is by hosting monthly learning sessions where we bring on board an array of subject matter experts in the legal field to talk to you about and share their expertise and knowledge with you. A couple of housekeeping points and what to expect before I officially introduce Simone. So today very much is going to be a casual conversation. I'll be asking Simone some questions, majority of which have come through from yourselves during the registration process. We will have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the conversation as well. So if you do have any questions that come up during our conversation, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens to submit those in, and I will do my best to try and get Simone to address as many of them as possible before we're out of time. There will also be a very short feedback poll at the end, so I do encourage you to take a couple of seconds to provide your feedback, because that just enables us to make these sessions more and more valuable for you each time. And finally, because it's a question that we always get asked, yes, this session is being recorded and the on-demand recording will be sent out to you via email either on Friday or early next week. So please keep an eye out for that email from us. Now, I think it's enough of me talking. Let's jump straight into it and welcome Simone. Thank you so much for coming on board and being part of the Intel series. How are you, first of all?
Very well, thanks, Ariana, and thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation and for everyone for joining us today.
Look, I think before we get started with all the serious questions, as a form of introduction, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in the cyber resilience space and in the legal space?
Sure, thank you. So the first thing I always say is that I'm not a techie. So I didn't come into this from the technical side. It's very much from the legal side. And how it came about was that I used to work for the largest professional indemnity insurer for lawyers in Australia, and I was their senior claims solicitor. So over that 20-year period, I'd handled around 2,000 professional indemnity notifications against law firms. And in the last few years, we started seeing claims of email fraud or business email compromise, where somebody has obviously, compromised a lawyer's email. So I was kind of quite fortunate to be at the coalface when these kind of events started happening, and I was very struck by the potential for this to be something that kind of grew exponentially, because in negligence cases against solicitors, it's very unusual for there to be, typically they're about a failure to advise, a failure to communicate properly or appropriately according to the client. But this was really different because it has nothing to do with whether your systems are breached, has nothing to do with how good you are as a lawyer. You could be the best litigator, the best trust advisor or whatever, but it still has everything to do with your professional duties. And not only that, I do recall one time where a solicitor called me to say that over the weekend he'd received 20, I think nearly 30 emails from clients saying, why are you asking me for money? And it was obvious he'd been hacked. And so you're in a situation where in a typical negligence case, there might be one or maybe even two people that might want to bring a claim. In this case, you're talking about potentially every client in your business being affected. So it just really struck me very early that this was a really different kind of risk for the legal profession and businesses. So I started my own business, Law and Cyber. I do a lot of work in educating different businesses, organisations, from sports organisations to legal organisations, and we've developed online training that's been rolled out through Law Society of South Australia, LPLC in Victoria, other organisations, and we've educated more than 10,000 lawyers and people that work at law firms now online. So in a legal practice, we advise people who've been impacted, either maybe they're having a ransomware event and they don't know what to do, what are they supposed to do in that situation, or people who've been the victim of scams, for example. And I've also had the privilege of giving expert evidence in expert written opinion in proceedings involving a lawyer who was unfortunately deceived into paying millions of dollars out of his trust account as a result of email-enabled fraud. So, you know, it really is a combination of, it really comes from my background in professional responsibility, especially for the legal profession, but it's kind of grown into, you know, cyber, which, as we all know from all the headlines, impacts every kind of organisation in Australia now.
Yeah, and apparently the legal industry, according to research by Macquarie Bank, actually is one of the top industries, specifically in Australia, that is at risk for cyber attacks, which is quite scary when you think about it.
It is, but if I can just interrupt there, because if you think about the information that we as lawyers have, firstly, we have to identify everybody that, you know, that if we're doing land transactions or really for everything, you need to make sure that your client is who they say they are. So people are often collecting identity documents and hanging on to those things. That's something most businesses don't do. We also have huge funds transfers in matters of, you know, if you think of the average price of a home in Sydney is, you know, $2-3 million now, if you're talking about a freestanding house. So you have lawyers who may be in small businesses, of course they might be huge businesses, but even in small businesses acting in matters where their clients are expecting to receive emails saying, please put $2 million into this trust account, or please put $500,000 into this trust account. So of course lawyers are going to be a target because they have valuable information that can be used for all sorts of purposes. They've got identity information, and they are transacting in really large amounts of money.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a good leadway into the first question, actually. So there certainly have been some important developments in the area of cyber risk and professional responsibility. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is quite an interesting area because there haven't really been published cases, which I think tells us something. We know we all get all those warnings, whatever state you're in, you know, from your insurance company or from your law society or law institute, about the growing amounts of cybercrime impacting the profession. But not surprisingly, nobody ever wants to be the person whose case goes into the public realm, right, through litigating and all of that. So we don't have the kind of case law to guide us on this stuff in the same way that we do for some other issues. But what I think is really interesting is that in February this year, the Law Institute of Victoria published its minimum cybersecurity expectations for law practices. And I really encourage everybody, if you haven't looked at that, I'm happy to share the link with you, Arena, if people want to have access to the document. But what the Law Institute of Victoria has a list of 3 things, which is critical controls, system controls, and behavioural controls. And it says what its expectations are. And it also makes it very clear that it regards not meeting some of those standards as amounting to unprofessional conduct or professional misconduct even. And in a worst case scenario, you can get struck off for professional misconduct. That's very unusual, but they're sending a very strong message that they they believe that this is a professional duty now that you do have adequate cybersecurity and that you do all of these things. And if I can just, when I heard about it, I originally thought it might be sort of fairly generic, basic stuff like, you know, you should have multi-factor authentication on your email or stuff like that. It's actually much, much more detailed expectations than that. And people really should take a look at it, whatever state that you're in, because in Victoria, that's what your regulator is saying. I'm based in New South Wales, but in New South Wales law, like in every state, the professional standards that you're expected to meet, sorry, they're in a professional negligence case, for example, the test will be, have you met a peer standard? Have you met the standard that is expected of your peers? And in New South Wales, it actually says your peers in Australia, not New South Wales. So we can expect that this is going to be, I mean, this is a very strong sign if one of the biggest states in Australia, the legal regulator says this is what you've got to do. That's a very, very telling sign of what would be expected in other states as well, even if it's not being sort of codified in that way.
Absolutely. Let's take a little step back, a bit of a macro perspective. So currently, what would you say is the biggest cyber risk that is facing Australian law firms, and how can they aim to address it?
So until maybe a year or two ago, I mean, people who work in this area have always been concerned about information theft as being really concerning for a number of reasons. Particularly, and I know a lot of the audience are, you know, from quite large firms. There's a range of people. But if you're, for example, advising organisations that work in critical infrastructure, things like, you know, and critical infrastructure is very broadly defined now. Now that can be financial services, it can be power stations, energy, roads, or whatever. In many respects, if you're a hostile nation state, for example, you might want to target a law firm rather than a great big multinational energy company or something to try and get the information, because law firms are a treasure trove of valuable information. We saw that with the HWL Ebsworth breach, that the huge amounts of data were exfiltrated or basically copied out of the system and published there as a result of the cyber attack on the firm. So information theft and what people can do with that, also particularly in relation to personal information. Because if you have someone's passport or driver's license, or, you know, a few and some information like that, well, then you can target them for identity fraud, or even something much more targeted, depending on what information they get from you. So I think people need to be really aware of that. Until that really high profile breach, people were really mainly focused on the funds transfer frauds, because that is the most obvious, and it's the most obvious case of loss too, where a client is deceived into paying money onto the wrong bank account, or where a solicitor pays money into the wrong account, or whatever. So information theft, funds transfer frauds, and ransomware, of course, which is if they either encrypt all your files so that you can't access your files, or alternatively, cyber extortion, where they actually get all your information and say, we're going to publish your client's information. Like we'll either just dump it on the dark web or sell it to people. So that kind of cyber extortion is a really, really horrible type of crime as well. So they would be the three things I would say.
Right. So, I mean, AI, right? It only took us 3 questions to get to this. So I'm very impressed. But there's obviously been the rise of AI technologies. We're talking deep fakes, voice files. And I know a lot of legal professionals are starting to become more and more concerned about this. How can law firms protect themselves from these advanced threats and ensure security of sensitive client data? I know that's a big question.
Yeah, well, I suppose the thing with AI is like on the plus side, it means that there's new tools using artificial intelligence that on the technical side are really, really helpful in that people that, you know, they can use those to get a sense of something really atypical is happening in the system, what's going on, is somebody in there, is someone copying stuff, whatever. So that's the plus side, is that there are the kind of tools that that can assist in cyber security. On the negative side is that things like scams and everything can just be so much more convincing. There was an incident a few months ago, I think it was Hong Kong or Singapore, I've forgotten now, but it was 25 US million was a person was a financial controller was tricked out of paying 25 million out of their bank account into a wrong bank account with when he was in what he thought was a conference with his boss and two other colleagues, and all of those images were actually deep fake people in the conference, like on a video conference. And this gentleman was really concerned when he got an email saying pay $25 million to this. And he said, I want to see you all online to check. But they actually were able to do that using deepfake technology. And there was a bit of talk around that. People just thought that was like a bogus story and whatever, but it's very genuine. It was an engineering company that's come out and admitted it was them. So I haven't heard of anything like that impacting an Australian law firm, but that's just to let you know, that's the technology. If you look at how good images are now and videos that are created using AI compared to just 18 months ago, it's an exponential level of improvement. Voices now, you get voices that sound really genuine, but aren't. So they can just grab 20 seconds of audio of your voice and create voice files that are so compelling your family will think it's you. So I think you know, we've been saying for some years now in the legal profession, if you get payment instructions by email, you need to confirm by picking up the phone. I think we're going to need something better than that. And unfortunately, I think some of the new digital identity tools are really going to help in that regard. But what it comes down to is that, I mean, as I said, I'm not a techie. What I talk about is really the human risk side. Most cyber incidents start with an email, basically, or a manipulation of people's natural tendency to trust in some way. Either it's a fake email or it's a fake phone call or whatever. So much is about actually educating your team, not just about phishing emails, because that's really important, but just to really understand that concept of social engineering and how it can be used for all sorts of different things. Like even the big Twitter hack they had a few years ago basically came through somebody ringing up and pretending to be, you know, from you know, someone that needed to talk to the service desk and all of that. And they managed to get in there and take over Bill Gates's account and Barack Obama's account and all of that just by tricking people. So I think that's a really key message.
Yeah. We'll get to it in a couple of questions time, just around some training that law firms can do for their employees to try and mitigate some of these risks. But before we get onto that, let's say the worst has happened and a business has had a breach. What actions can a law firm take immediately after discovering the data breach? Is there any specific best practices specifically tailored for the legal industry to follow?
Well, the first thing is that the concept of resilience with cyber is like saying we're going to do everything we can to prevent a cyber incident happening through having the right technology and good processes and educating our people. But resilience is also recognizing that in spite of your best efforts, something could go wrong and you should think about it and plan before something happens. So one of the things that I do with organizations is run cyber incident tabletop exercises, which is where we have a simulated incident with the leadership of an organization around a table, and basically everyone has to role play what they're going to do if there's a cyber incident. And the precursor to that is that you need to have a cyber incident response plan. So I'm coming back to your question now, because really the ideal thing is that you have a plan before this even happens to you, that you accept that unfortunately it could happen. So you're going to have things like you're going to know what your insurance policies cover, what they say, who are the people you need to contact. I'm aware of one firm that had a cyber incident, a kind of a smallish firm, and their practice manager, they had cyber insurance, but their practice manager was away on holidays and nobody knew who their cyber insurer was. And because all their files were encrypted in this ransomware attack, they didn't even know. So they had purchased cyber incident insurance so that they could ring up for help, but they didn't know who it was. So things like making sure you've got accessible copies, like in hard copies for the key people, having a plan about what you're going to do, who you're going to get technical assistance from in that situation. One thing people should be aware of that I wasn't aware of when I sort of started out on this is that, you know, the people who do cyber incident response are highly technical experts in that work. They do it day in and day out, so they know what ransomware is going around. They might have the keys to unlock the ransomware. So you don't in that situation necessarily want to rely on your internal people. You want to go to the specialists in that, so you want to have those kind of contact details handy. Recognize also, I guess, give some thought to what is the kind of information, like what are we most scared of, and what kind of information do we have, and how would we prioritize what we need to do? So the kind of first questions people need to think about are, who am I going to ask for help? Is it an insurer? Is it a hotline? Is it the specialist people that we've got on standby? Is it then, can we keep working? What can we do? Who do we have to tell? Do we have to warn our clients? Are we worried these people are going to do something to harm our clients? Do we need to tell them? Do we need to tell a regulator? That sort of thing. And interestingly, just circling back to that Victorian cybersecurity expectations document that I mentioned, one of the things in behavioural controls that they say could be conduct capable of constituting unprofessional conduct or professional misconduct is not having a cyber incident response plan with assigned roles and responsibilities. And they say that they'll take into account if you've notified them promptly or not. So, you know, they'll be watching who you notified. So every firm's different, and every firm's going to, you know, have its own priorities. But it's really important to remember that you can't sort of assess the value of. You need to assess the value of information, not just what it's worth to you, but what it might be worth to someone else. You might think, I'm a fairly small firm, no one's ever going to attack me, but it may be that there's information there that they can use to blackmail you or blackmail your clients, that kind of thing. So, then you need to kind of give some thought to, well, what are the priority things that we have to start thinking about? And of course, on the technical side, then you would want to have advisors sort of saying, well, this is what we know they've got access to. This is what we think they might have access to, that kind of thing. And hopefully being able to, if you have a ransomware attack, then restore everything from backups as well and stuff like that. So that's just a hint of some of the things that you would want to think about as it develops.
That's a lot. That's heavy. I think it's very much a case of being proactive versus reactive. As you said, a lot of businesses probably don't think that they will fall into that risk element and be attacked, but you just never know as well. So I think that's a very good point that you mentioned. Is this something actually that your firm can assist with in terms of putting a plan together?
Very happy to help people. That is something we do in terms of, if you want to have internal policies, for example, as well, about how you manage cyber in your firm or your business. We absolutely do that, and cyber incident response plans as well. So yeah, definitely.
Okay, yeah, good to know.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
asking.
So just a little pivot. You mentioned briefly regulatory. Oh my gosh, I need more coffee. And legal expectations regarding cybersecurity have evolved in recent years. What do law firms need to do to ensure they're meeting these heightened standards?
Yeah, so I've obviously mentioned the Victorian standards, but and the professional standards everywhere in Australia, you have a duty of competency. You have now in America, they have what's called a duty of technological competency. So they have the same duty of competency, but the American bar rules make it very clear that that includes managing technology competently, so that if you use technology, you're supposed to be aware of the risks and benefits of it, but also the benefits, that you shouldn't be spending millions of dollars doing something if there's an automated tool that your clients could, pay a small amount of money for. So there is this concept of competency now that incorporates technology, because of course we all use it. So, and cybersecurity is part of that. So professional rules, that duty of competency is going to involve this kind of knowledge of cyber risks and making sure that you remediate it. There's always a duty to put the client's interests first. That's something people have to think about. If they have a cyber incident, no one's going to want to tell anyone. That's completely natural. But you may be obliged to, and you may be obliged to do that under fiduciary duties as well. In terms of some of the other legal issues, Privacy Act now for organisations, which applies for organisations of more than $3 million annual revenue. The fines for serious and repeated breaches have gone from $2 million to up to $50 million in the last year. The law is changing, so it's going to be, more onerous, but, trying to protect individuals' privacy and personal information. And we've seen the Privacy Commissioner now move a little bit from that more educational role to actually going after organisations that haven't met what they think are sufficient standards. So we all know that Medibank was hacked, obviously. 10 million people's personal information, including some of the most sensitive health information, was breached. Medibank is now the subject of a class action commenced by 3 or 4 different groups, including their shareholders. But now the Privacy Commissioner has also said that they are prosecuting Medibank for not taking reasonable steps as required under the Privacy Act to protect information. And in theory, I mean, this is the thing that grabbed all the headlines. It's like a $5 trillion fine or something. No one expects that that's what's really going to be ordered, because nobody could even pay that. But there's so many breaches. What they're saying is that failure to protect customers applies to every single person, like 10. So that's 10 million times. So, so the privacy regulator is definitely going to be, going after organisations more now, and we've seen that with some of the other prosecutions that they're doing as well.
Right. Digital identity. So what are the potential benefits that digital identity laws can offer to law firms? And how can they leverage these laws to enhance their cybersecurity measures?
So digital identity, and people might have seen like a story about that this week, where the Minister, Bill Shorten, has announced that they're rolling out a pilot where people can use their phone to scan a QR code to get into a club, for example, without actually having to show their driver's license and for a copy to be taken, because before that stage, people will have installed an app that has verified that they are who they say they are, through a whole bunch of different means, like different things like, you have to obviously access the phone, download the app, facial recognition. They check that the face matches what's held on the passport or driver's license with the Department of, the Digital Verification Service. So that's all done technologically without anybody having to actually show their driver's license to someone. Then they'll get you to show hold something up or smile or whatever. So it's called the proof of life thing, so that you have to prove that you're actually alive while you're using it, while you're registering yourself into this process. So they can't just use a static photograph, for example. So there'll be a whole bunch of things like that one application will do. And then once you've done all that, you've got that digital identity, and you can use that to prove who you are wherever you go, or if you're a client, proving in a transaction you are who you say you are, for example. So digital identity, I think, has a massive opportunity to reduce fraud in Australia, not but for legal practices, but for everyone. But also because it means that all these smaller businesses or big businesses aren't going to be keeping people's identity documents anymore, because all that process is done by another source, whatever particular product that you decide to sign up for. And then you don't have to, send a copy of your identity documents to a solicitor who might then send them to other people that you never even knew about. So you keep control of your identity. It's not like you're sending identity documents and you don't know where they go or where they're stored. It also means that law firms are going to be less of a honeypot because they won't keep that anymore. So the digital, I think it's extremely exciting from the point of view of reducing the risk for legal practices and all businesses by not having that information. Because if you don't have it, then it can't be breached. So it'd be interesting to see what happens with that. The government scheme is being rolled out later this year, but there's already private sector organisations that are working in this space with the tools, and it's, I just think it's just much more secure, potentially. The flip side that some people are concerned about, with good reason, is we just want to make sure this doesn't mean that there is some other big repository of information that then becomes the honeypot. So without going too much into that, there's two different models. There'll be digital identity providers that do kind of have that, and then there's other ones that don't keep anything, and everything's just done via that kind of phone exchange that I mentioned.
Very interesting to see what's going to be happening in that space. Let's circle back quickly, because you did touch on it, cyber insurance. What role does that play in law firms' overall cyber resilience strategy? And is there anything that firms should specifically be looking for within the policy?
So I think the first point, I would make is that the real key, and it's just it sounds obvious, but it needs to be said, is it's always in this space about prevention, not response, right? Because no insurance policy is going to cover you for all of the damage that you can have, things like reputational damage and so on. But that said, cyber insurance policies do offer some really valuable cover, especially that kind of access to experts who can, on the technical side, support you through something, but also through an incident. But also on the legal side, notifications advising you, what you need to do. It covers you for things like business interruption. But just to make the point, there's different kinds of cyber insurance cover. So, for example, here in New South Wales, the insurer, our PI insurer, provides everyone with $50,000 worth of cover to, if you're insured under the PI, you get that. That will help you. That gives things like cyber incident response and what have you, and business interruption up to $50,000 if you're a big, and that's really, really, really helpful to people, because third-party claims by clients are going to probably be under the PI cover. They're more typically going to be that under that $2 million cover. But if you're a larger firm, you're going to want a lot more cover than that. $50,000 isn't much for business interruption if you've got 100 people working for you, right? So, and you've got 100 people who can't work for 2 or 3 days or whatever. So again, it's a question of weighing risk, what you're most concerned about. Think about what the downside might be for you. If you don't have access to that expert advice, then cyber insurance is a good place to get that.
Fantastic. Considering how sophisticated cyber threats are becoming, what can law firms do to train their staff to be more aware of these types of threats and kind of mitigate that risk?
I think the profession's been really good at explaining to people. Like, I think everybody now verifies payment instructions received by email using another method like a phone call or whatever. But it's just really important to understand that these kind of threats are evolving all the time. And yes, there's phishing awareness training, that's really important. But not everything is like a phishing email. HWL Ebsworth, we know, had that really major breach, and they said publicly that it came about as a result of a failure of multi-factor authentication. They said they didn't know how exactly that happened. But one of the ways that multi-factor authentication can fail is called MFA fatigue. So when people get so many notifications that bug them, at one, they just kind of press yes and grant access. So it's just important that people have, I think, a somewhat holistic understanding, not just just the links, because yes, that's important, that something could be a dodgy link. But it's important to understand that whole concept of social engineering and manipulation can apply in different ways. It could be getting heaps of messages on your multi-factor authentication. It could be a phone call or whatever. Just unfortunately to be a bit skeptical of anything. And as I said, at some point it's even going to be a risk about deep fakes and things like that.
Yeah. I know there's probably a lot of resources and training materials available as well, and Law and Cyber also offers some training. Did you want to touch a little bit on that for anyone that might be interested in upskilling themselves or their staff?
Yeah, thank you. And I know that there's a few people online that have done the firm's training, and so thank you very much to those people for joining today as well. Look, I created training bearing in mind what I've seen in-house, what I've seen on both sides. Like, I mean, I've seen it from the point of view of being asked to give expert evidence and being in that privileged position of seeing what's happened. I've acted for people who've been scammed, and I've acted for the lawyers who've been sued. So I've seen it from all the different angles, and I really felt that the kind of education that we as professionals in the legal profession needed wasn't available in a really accessible form. I thought it was also really important that there be education that's not just for lawyers or staff, but to reiterate that it's everybody's responsibility in the business, in the organisation, to understand these things. So I created an online course about 4 years ago. It's an hour, it takes about an hour, but we've updated it multiple times over those 4 years, including most recently to cover those issues like deep fakes and the dangers of using ChatGPT and putting your client information into that and so on. So it's really been specifically written for lawyers and law firms. I'm not aware of something else like genuinely out there like that at the moment. The other thing is in-person training, but I think this is not the kind of area that's set and forget. You have to update. You have to keep reminding people, and you really need to do an update at least every year on new things to remind people. A lot of cyber insurers actually require that too, that you do train your staff every year. So our training's been endorsed by some leading professional bodies, including, as I said earlier, LPLC, Law Society South Australia, PEXA. So it's been designed for the specific needs of lawyers, bearing in mind they operate trust accounts and have all that valuable information.
What we might do, Simone, is if you can send me a little bit of information on this course, I might just include that as part of the email with the recording at the end of this, just for anyone who's interested, if we can make it easier for you to access that that training more information, I would love to do that. So
Thank you. Thank you.
we'll touch base at the end of our conversation and just make sure that we send some information out for people to access.
Thank you.
So we do have a few more questions, but we are wrapping up. I wanted to ask you, Simone, obviously law firms are using multiple systems to, whether it's practice management systems, CRMs, etc. So from a third-party vendor perspective, how can law firms ensure that their vendors are actually maintaining strong cyber resilience measures?
Yeah, so that's that's a really curly one, because we know that technology companies have their own terms and conditions, and that they're not entirely forthcoming about amending those if you want to. But third-party risk or fourth or fifth party risk of who, like, you might engage with one vendor and then they use other vendors as well, right? And the fact that we're also interconnected these days is a big risk area. So I think part of due diligence is actually asking questions about, what levels of certification. There's different levels of certification, whether it's the Australian Cybersecurity Centre's Essential 8 or ISO 27001 and whatever. You want to ask if people are meeting industry standards. You want to have an agreement if there's a breach, how quickly they're going to tell you, for example. Building kind of things into your contracts like that.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of communicating with clients, how can law firms essentially communicate their cybersecurity efforts to their own clients, just to build trust and really demonstrate to them that the commitment to protecting the client's sensitive information?
Yeah, well, one thing that's a really great idea, and I know LPLC has been doing it for quite a few years now, and I think in New South Wales we have it too, is that there is a form that you can literally, an information thing that just tells clients about these things. And one of the risk factors for lawyers is that their clients are going to do something like pay money to the wrong bank account when they get a scam email, because we hear about this stuff every day. But literally, I mean, I've acted for 2 first home buyers that have paid their deposit to the wrong organisation based on a fraudulent email, and those poor women had never bought a property before. How would they know that, if they haven't been warned, right? So so it's about warning your clients, informing them, saying, look, this could happen. People could impersonate us. Here's our information form to tell you that. I certainly have in, our terms and conditions, just our terms for our clients, letting them know that, internet isn't always secure, that, we can't guarantee certain things, letting them know about funds transfer frauds. A lot of people have something on their email. That's good, but it's not some kind of something in size 1 font is not necessarily a meaningful warning. It's much better than nothing, but it's not the same as actually having a conversation or giving a detailed brochure or something like that. So I think proactively showing that you care about your client in that way is really important.
Simone, I have one last question for you. Before I ask that, now's a good time to remind everyone on the call, if you do have any questions for Simone, please submit them through the Q&A button. I know there's a couple that's already come through, but we have about 15 minutes left. So if you have a pressing question, please send it through. We'll touch on it. So you did mention very briefly at the start a recent high-profile data breach that has happened in Australia for one of major law firms. Can you talk a little bit about that, specifically about what steps could have been taken to prevent it, and what can other law firms learn from this incident?
So, so full disclosure, I was an affected client in that. So I do want to disclose that. I think what the firm has said said publicly, I've mentioned that it was some kind of failure of multi-factor authentication. And they have said that it was a junior person who's accidentally, totally no suggestion it was anything other than accidental, has approved that in some way. And we don't know exactly how that's happened. What the firm did, which was very interesting, is that they did take out an injunction to prevent the hackers from publishing the information once that they had received a ransom demand and they became aware that they had that information and that it had been published on the dark web. But it was actually very accessible to people. The dark web is obviously part of the internet where all sorts of bad stuff is stolen or whatever, sold. So they took out an injunction, and I think a lot of people kind of laughed at that, especially in the media. It's like, your hackers are criminals in another country overseas, as if they're going to care about an injunction that says you're not allowed to publish it. But the really interesting thing that came from that is that there was also an order saying that anyone who was aware of that order also could not publish it. So what that did is it prevented secondary publication by the news outlets in Australia, for example, for anybody going searching for it. It was saying, if we've got this injunction, you are breaking the law if you go looking for that information about our clients. So that was a really interesting thing to do, and I think a lot of law firms would do something similar, and it was actually, I think, a really effective way to stop having the spread of that information more broadly. But I guess it's a different look. That's a really delicate example to talk about. We all know, and an awful situation for the firm, but also the clients who were affected. But I think it really brought home the risks, especially to larger firms. People always go, yeah, I don't understand this, but luckily, I've got an IT, great chief technology officer, or, I don't need to understand, someone else looks after that. And I think it really brought home to everybody that no firm is too big to have this happen to them, or too sophisticated.
And even if you've got an internal IT teams looking after this is way beyond something that one team can manage. Absolutely, this is a firm-wide responsibility in any business, even outside law firms.
Yeah, exactly. Because when that happens, right, it's not, it's going to be the CEO of the firm or the managing partner or whatever who's then going to have to front the media about that kind of stuff. So there's all the issues about what kind of communications you're going to have, stakeholder management. Like in the case of that breach, we know that there was something like 65 government departments or agencies were impacted in that. So there's lots of stakeholders as well, lots of stakeholder management, communications. It's not just a technology issue and something like that goes wrong. You have to have plans for that stuff.
Yeah. All right, thank you, Simone. We have a couple of questions that come through that I'd like to ask you now. One of our attendees would like to know, what would you say is a fair percentage for a medium-sized suburban law firm to set aside for cybersecurity management?
So thank you for the question. I suppose I think that question isn't something I feel comfortable answering, because I don't think it is about a percentage. I mean, let's say you earn $100,000 a year, or 100 million. You have a professional duty and a legal duty to take reasonable steps to protect that information. It's not a question of a percentage of your revenue. I mean, I certainly do think that people are going to naturally expect higher standards of firms that are getting hundreds of millions worth of revenue, but I don't think it's a percentage. I don't think it's a percentage issue. I think it's and you can't have sweeping statements about this, but there are certain things that don't cost any money that everybody should do. Things like multi-factor authentication, backups, check your backups. warn your clients, all of that stuff. It doesn't matter what your income is. You need to be doing that. Antivirus software, anti-phishing software, prompt installation of updates and things like that. So I understand why that person asked that question, but I can't answer it in that way.
No, which is fair, which is fair. Actually, interesting, you touched on multi-factor authentication. We did have a question around that, and just some best practices around 2FA. Is there anything that you can, you mentioned briefly, for example, fatigue around multi-factor
MFA fatigue?
authentication? Yeah. Is there any good practices, even in terms of, personally, because we all experience this in our everyday life, doesn't matter what app we're signing into, we're asked to verify identity every couple of weeks at the minimum, if not every single time we sign in. How do we just pay more attention?
So I guess one thing to be aware of is that MFA using SMS, text messages, is not as safe as using an app like, a Google Authenticator or something like that. Because if somebody can do a SIM swap on your phone, then they'll get your codes, right? Even if they don't have your device, if it's a text message, but they can't get into your app. And I certainly know of one case that LPLC talked about where they were able to get access to that. They took, I think, $100,000 or $200,000 out of a lawyer's trust account by getting onto the help desk for the lawyer's telco and getting them to activate call forwarding, and which meant all the messages went to their device. They did this late at night, and then they also got onto the bank's help desk and changed it from a security token to a text message. And then, of course, the lawyer didn't get that. So meanwhile, when the codes were coming, so you asked me about best practice. It's much better to have an application rather than use SMS for that kind of stuff. As I mentioned, I think the digital ID stuff is going to have really exciting potential going forward. I think just to remember that the more stuff you store in your browser, if people can get remote access to a computer, then they can get all of those things as well. And with the MFA fatigue, I know with one organisation that I got a thing, if you get a notification and you have not tried to get into that particular website or whatever, they've got your password, because then they've got the next step has come through. So you need to, do something about that and alert people as soon as possible. So just be aware that, like everything else, the cyber criminals are always just that little bit ahead. So you have to keep evolving. And now that concept of MFA fatigue, I think, is important that staff understand that as well.
It's interesting that you talk about that, because actually last week, one of my colleagues in the UK was trying to access our Google account for the company. So then I woke up to messages from Google on my phone alerting me, like, someone's trying to log into your Google account. Like, are you aware of this? Is this you? And it's like 2 a.m. in the morning, obviously, because of the time difference. I just had to have a good laugh about it. I was like, are you trying to hack into this account? Because you just never know. And the communication is so important internally. Sometimes it could be very much as simple as having clear communication amongst your team members to make sure that everyone's kind of aware also who should have access to what, before people try to log into stuff like sharing information. Simone, thank you so much. There's definitely a lot to process, and I know this is a topic or a space in terms of cybersecurity that's always changing. So it's fantastic to have you come and share some of your insights, because it's continually evolving. So I'm sure that maybe some point in the near future, in the new year, I would love to have you come back and and share what's happening in the space then in 6 months' time.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for having me along, Arena, and asking me, because it's they're really good, really good questions, and it's really important to me. I've worked with law firms all my life in one way or another, and you know, I think this is, you know, I don't want to get too heavy about it, but you know, it's our country's security, it's our personal security. You know, we all need to learn this stuff, and so much has happened since we all left school and whatever. We've never really got trained about it. So thank you for the opportunity to come today.
No, absolutely. Look, we do have 3 minutes left. There has been a few questions that have come through. If you're happy to stay on and answer those.
Yeah.
What I might do in the meantime is just watch the feedback poll quickly. So it literally takes maybe 20 seconds. A question from one of the audience around browser security, Simone. Do you recommend a password vault app? Sorry, that's my accent there. Instead of reliance on a password manager, regardless of whether staff are logged into their account. For example, Gmail or Microsoft when using Chrome and Edge.
Okay, so again,
yeah. So I want to butcher that.
Yeah, in terms of like specific products or safety or whatever, you really should talk to your IT people about that. But just as a general concept, I certainly use a password manager. I recommend that everyone have a password manager because it's kept separate. A lot of those kind of different things will store stuff in your browser. You know, that's how they got into to Medibank. It was a contractor who had access to Medibank systems. They got in via his home computer through something in the browser. So it's always more helpful to have strong passwords, passphrases, they're saying rather than passwords, etc. We all know the human brain can't remember the level of complexity that we need to have now, 12, 16 or whatever. So you do need something, but an app, a really secure app is a good way to keep it separate from your browser in case your computer gets compromised in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Simone. I appreciate you coming on board. I know we had some positive feedback come through, so I know this was definitely a very valuable, informative session for those who registered and attended. Have a lovely day. Please send through some information about the courses that you offer and make sure to share that out to everyone that's registered along with the recording, and we'll keep in touch. And thank you everyone for taking the time to attend. Thank you, Simone.
Thank you. Bye.